Hi, and welcome to Talking Wildfire. Today I'm here with David Packham, and we're going to talk about something that's not talked about a lot these days. It's about native fire use and the situation internationally around the world concerning natives in fire. This is David Packham, and we're going to have a talk with you in just a moment here.
Good, thank you, Mike. Well, I've been a physical scientist all my life and a chemist and so forth, but that hasn't stopped me working in the bushfire area. And I've just been watching uh, on your sessions Phil Cheney, who has a forester's point of view on fires, which is terrific. Phil and I have worked together for possibly about 60 or more years now. And uh, however, when I started on bushfires, I was working in CSIRO, a very big organisation within Australia, and with a chemical engineer called Alan King. Now, Alan King was a terribly creative and very clever person. And whilst he was the pioneer of heat and mass transfer inside bushfires, um, how much radiation there is inside the fire, how much convection, and how does it change. He also had a tremendous curiosity about where it all fitted in the total environment. Alan had been a bikie in his time and sort of had a very good view of other bits of life that many of us don't. Anyway, in the early time, and I joined him in 1962. In 1963, he published the first historical literature search on bushfires and the effect of colonisation. And he published the first bit, and there is the first publication. It's called The Report on the Influence of Colonisation on the Forests and the Prevalence of Bushfires in Australia. And it's put out by the Division of Physical Chemistry in CSIRO. I don't know, and it's the literature was searched very thoroughly, because as I turned to the first sort of page, I find that the third reference was to Cook, Captain James Cook, 1785. Later on, William Dampier, names I'm sure are known to all your listeners, 1699. Matthew Flinders. Now, Matthew Flinders did a lot of things in the world, 1801. They were the first people who noticed that there was fire naturally here in Australia when they first came, and they were pretty much the first people, but not totally, because I noticed that the Chinese feel that they were here in 1421 or thereabouts. And I can't remember, having just read the book 1421, whether they talked about fire and smoke down here. But we'll go back and have another look. Then where we have got to with this concept that the Indigenous people looked after Australia with fire, which I think is absolutely true. Where we have got to is pretty much conclusive, and it's in this book by Bill Gamage, Professor Bill Gamage, who is one of Australia's great historians, just been published, called The Biggest Estate on Earth. And the subtitle, I'll read, How Aborigines Made Australia. And I think it is absolutely correct. Now, there are still some Indigenous practitioners here in Australia, mostly, well, almost totally north of the Tropic of Capricorn. And in northern Australia, something like 46% of the countryside of the savannas burn each year. And now that is being done both by the graziers and, more importantly, is done in one of our great big national parks called Kakadu. The Indigenous people have taken that on. And there was a lady that I sort of mentored called Kathy Robinson, who wrote a wonderful paper now some 30 years ago, I suppose, could be a little less, but not much, on how the Indigenous people looked after the country and what we should do to integrate them back into the fire management. Now, that's terribly difficult here in Australia, in southern Australia, because we don't have enough Indigenous people anymore to be able to burn sufficient country in the sufficient way that they knew how to do it to fix up the mess that has been made in the years since colonisation. This is not just us who have been negligent in looking after our bush, because the real aim in fire management, to me, is to, in my opinion, is to look after the environment, to make the environment healthy and safe. Because once you get those two things, and that is what it was like in the first colonisation of Australia 200 odd years ago, once you have got the environment right, all the other issues disappear. The life threat, the threat to our infrastructure, the threat to the environment itself, the flora and fauna, and the humans, that all disappears. That's all gone. Now, that's been demonstrated in Western Australia, where they have done it. And science requires you to have an understanding of the theory, of the ideas behind it all, but that's only a small fraction of it. It requires you also to validate your hypothesis. You just cannot continue, as we are continuing with a lot of our fire ecology at the moment, by just modelling the fire. Now, I'll tell you why you'll never succeed in modelling a fire. I do know, because I was in the atmosphere, in the meteorological business for a while, I do know that the forecasting of weather is a very difficult thing and has become just sort of possible from the wonderful work of the theoreticians and a thing called the Navier-Stokes equation. But it is terribly complex, and the concept of a chaotic structure, of a chaotic system, came out of meteorology. It is so chaotic that the little changes here, you big changes everywhere. So fires require a good knowledge of meteorology and of the weather, and which is chaotic. But that's not all. The chemistry inside the flame is also chaotic. It is a very difficult thing to model what is going on inside the flame. That is getting better and almost as could be pretty soon, because of the immense interest in the internal combustion engine, and the jet engine has led the people like Hoyt Hottle and W.C. Emmons, great American combustion scientists, to lay the foundation for the tremendously good chemistry that's going on in combustion now. And I imagine that Boeing would be about the best people in the world in that area, who would know a lot about, and Rolls-Royce and Pratt and Whitney. And so you've got two chaotic, you've got the weather and the flame, but then have a look at the bush. Every inch of the bush is different. I think Phil made many comments about this. That's another chaotic environment. You've got 6 chaotic environments. You're never going to succeed in getting very accurate modelling. So you especially must not make your policy decisions based on modelling. It's got to be based on what actually happens out there where it is validated. And of course, my view is that the West Australians knew the theory, worked on the theory, and set up a system and then validated it. So it took us about 3 years to get the aerial prescribed burning sort of accepted as a legitimate operation in the forestry. It took them another 5 years to turn it into a forestry operation that could really function in a bureaucracy or in a big organisation, and took them another 5 years to turn it into an absolutely routine operation that it has reached in many parts of the world today. Now, it wasn't just Australia, 200 years since colonisation, that changed the nature of fire, as Alan King pointed out. The influence of the influence of colonisation on bushfires. It happened also in North America, probably older than that, probably 300 or 400 years ago, when the colonisation of North America. That is when, especially on the western side of North America, and probably on the eastern side as well, because I have a sneaking feeling that the sort of oak trees and those type of trees, different to eucalypts, still had a relationship with fire. So it was round about that time that the probably, and I think our friend Stephen J. Pine might well agree or disagree with this. It would be very interesting. It was about that time, and I do know that the people from the Tallahassee forest ecology in Florida carried out 60 or 70 years ago a lot of arguments about the role of natural or indigenous fire, especially on the western coast of the United States. And then not only there, but in Europe, in the Middle Ages, there was clearly indigenous fire going on there, because there was a fire in the Black Forest that smoke logged Stockholm and London. So fire in our natural environment, and the people who live in their natural environment are, of course, the indigenous people, and they had a relationship with it, just as Phil Cheney had talked about before in one of your other sessions. So having seen the beneficial effects of fire, having talked to some of these indigenous people, having been across the literature, I'm confident in the opinion that a lot of what we need to know, if not almost all of it, about how to put fire back in the environment comes out of the indigenous areas. The problem is that a lot of that has been lost. We are having to rediscover it, some of it, and we have to do it on an industrial scale, because our forests here in Australia, I think in America, from what I've seen in the Mediterranean areas, Greece and Spain, and then to my somewhat surprise, the Hawaiian disaster fits into this whole pattern as well. Now, an interesting thing, and in my meteorological time, I did a study on, and it was published in a forest and fire meteorology conference, the only one that's been held out of the United States. It was in Lawn. Lawn was a holiday resort here in Victoria. That there was this conference, and the paper that we presented, or the work that we had done, was available there. And what it showed was that when indigenous burning ceased around the world, the Earth's average temperature, we almost probably speculated, we had good evidence for it, but not perfect. We claimed that the Earth's temperature had increased by 1 degree, and that's half of what they're panicking about these days. So there is quite a role, and that was also assisted by NASA just a couple of years ago had found some smoke plumes out of Australia, and I think that was probably the 2018 fires, 18, 19, were impinging upon South America. So to stop this natural burning has, I argue, increased the Earth's temperature by about 1 degree, and they're panicking about 2 degrees at the moment. Now, where this goes, I don't know. I would love to see some very good research and some research done by people who are interested in the facts, not the ideology in that particular area. It is not difficult to mimic industrially aircraft, spot fires, good forecasting, which is a really major interest that has got to take place, because what we're finding here in Australia is that about every 27 and a half years, which is a stupid statistical result, because we don't get any disaster fires in the middle of winter. So say about every 30 years, we do get a disaster fire. The last one was 2009, with, if life loss is a measure of the size of or impact of the fire, then 2009 was our really big one. And it isn't the biggest because the a hotter, nastier day was in 1851. And so the people who are running around claiming that, oh boy, we've never had it as bad as this, they're wrong. They've had it worse before. Only by a little bit, but it was. So what makes up a disaster fire? Well, the fire intensity, and we are the bushfire, the wildfire in our research people will forever be indebted to George Byram. Now, George Byram was an American super scientist, forester, and meteorologist, I think, who generated two things for which he will always be known. One is the Byram Fire Intensity Index. It is rigorous. It is as solid as the laws of gravity of Newton. It doesn't require a convenient little fiddle factor that a lot of other research does. The facts don't fit the theory, so we'll put another factor in there and let that be deemed. And until we do manage to get the theory and the observations back together again. Byram didn't have this at all. He had it was very simple, very rigorous, and to know the intensity of the fire, you only have to know the amount of heat that comes out of a kilogram of fuel, the amount of fuel that's been burnt, and the rate of spread. All of these things are so easily forecast these days. So there is a good relationship that explains half the deaths, that the more intense the fire, the more deaths you will get. The other half, which I haven't got any information on because I don't have the time or the years, I suppose, to set or the support to settle down to do it, is how many people are exposed to the fire. So if it was in the wilderness of Australia, there likely to be none. But if it's in a very high-risk place like the Dandenongs here in Victoria, the Blue Mountains in Sydney, the escarpment at the back of Perth, and the hills at the back of Los Angeles, three places that really jump to mind, where you have a big exposure of people and you have a pretty large fuel situation. They all combine. Now, one of the things that does happen down here, and I don't know if it happens elsewhere, there's things called the Rossby waves, and the Rossby waves are the high pressures and the low pressures that circulate around the southern hemisphere. When the pressures get too high and too low, and especially if they meet a land mass, of which Australia is one, because they come from Africa. These Rossby waves come from Africa and right around. And when they meet that land mass, they do what waves in the ocean do. They break. When they break, we find that every Australian disaster fire has had a Rossby wave breaking associated with it. There's about 10 per year, and not every Rossby wave that breaks has a fire with it. But these waves, which Professor Michael Reeder from Monash University has done the work on this, these can be detected from up to 14 days out. That gives us a very powerful way of knowing when this 1 in 30 year fire could be occurring. You also need over here, and I suspect that this is true and seemed to be true with the Hawaiian situation, that you need a period of unusual drought, unusual lack of rain, the bush, and that leads to an interesting thing, the relationship between fuel moisture. Oh, by the way, the Byron Fire Intensity Index is known in America, and I'm sure Mike, you know it, the hauling index. That is, haul your ass out of here when the intensity gets up. And Byron was one of the huge American scientists. Abe Broido was one. And he also developed what's called the Keach-Byram Drought Index, which is the amount of, I hope I'm not telling people here in Australia we have a thing, so telling people to suck eggs. I don't know if that's an international phrase or not, but I'm hoping I'm not telling you how to suck eggs. But the Keach-Byram Drought Index is the amount of rain that you need to saturate the soils of southern east United States around Florida, because that's where he did his work. And would you believe it works nicely here from a fire point of view. We have it metric, so we go from 0 to 200. I think the American version is still in inches or points of rain. I think it goes to 0 to 800. But let me be metric, because otherwise I'll be arrested, I'm sure, by the Thought Police. And the maximum is 200 millimetres. That's as dry as you can get the soil. Take 200 millimetres of rain to saturate it. And the rule of thumb, which has got to have some good research in it, I'm just giving more or less opinion here, or rules of thumb. The old crusty old foresters would say to me, until we don't have to worry about big fires until the drought index reaches 100. Well, it does this, it zeroes in the winter or comes very close to it and gives you a very powerful way of having an idea of what the season is coming. Now, at this moment, and I'm just about to calculate it again and probably send it out through the internet, that with the drought KBDI in Victoria is about 58, a long way, and it won't be until December that we could even get to the magic 100, as long as it doesn't rain again, and it's almost certain to. So that gives you an idea of what the next season might be like. And the good thing about that is that stops the nonsense that we see every year. Oh, this is going to be the worst year we've ever had. We've had a meeting, we've all decided it's going to be the worst. Well, it'll only be the worst every 30 odd years. So they get 29 errors out of a 30. That's not looking to be a good mark to me. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and the science has got to be good, and it's got to be divorced from people's incomes, from people's ideologies, from people's power and political ambitions. It's got to be rigorous because people die, and it is very serious when they die. The environment gets destroyed, the flora and fauna. They're not all as fast as the kangaroos I see behind you to keep out of the way of a lot of it. But it's just got to be right. We just can't afford to be wrong. It's a bit like the military strategic analysts. They have to be right because the consequences of being wrong are too big. So I've moved around a few subjects there, and there's probably a few more to go. So is that time to say any questions?
I do have a question for you, David. Can you give us a quick tour of native populations around the world that use fire historically, just so our listeners can know that it's on a large scale, like by continent, just what you know? Can you share a little bit of that with us?
Yes. Well, what I know is what I have just observed as I have passed through some of these areas. And of course, the Australian Indigenous people are fortunate or unfortunate enough to be right in the forefront of this because we have a lot of country to burn and a lot of country here does burn. I had the pleasure of spending 3 months in Indonesia looking at the fire situation there because there was a lot of smoke and people in Singapore and everywhere were getting very cross about it. And what has happened there was that it was quite clear to me that the indigenous people, especially in places like Borneo, their whole culture and subsistence was based around a very careful, intelligent, informed use of fire. So they would clear a bit of the jungle, they let it dry, they would plant their crops, and then they would have to move on because the nutrient balances and everything was not really sustainable. So they would then leave that area for it to recover. It's pretty clear to me that that's happening in the Amazon. The huge stuff we hear in the Amazon is that the indigenous people, and indigenous people are anybody who has lived there for a very long time. And the same thing seems to be happening there. There seems to be serious uproar about what's happening to these people and their fire knowledge. The good work that has been done in the United States with the American Indian is now starting to be recognised, as far as I can see, that they have a knowledge built from thousands of years of having fire as part of their culture. And I'll go right back to the Middle Ages and say that I don't know who the indigenous people were in the Black Forest, but I bet there were some that have been living there for a long time. And I suspect very strongly that this is happening in Greece, and I have seen the indigenous use of fire in Africa, which I think is still strong and rampant. So it is a universal thing, and it's about time that we recognised it, used it, and incorporated them.
David, can you talk a little bit about how indigenous fire use shapes different environments or different ecosystems? I know offline we've talked a little bit about this, but for instance, in Australia or Africa or Indonesia, different areas. But can you give us just a short talk on that for our viewers that don't know much about this subject?
Well, compared to the amount of information that should be available in the subject, I don't know much about it either. And I do feel a bit uncomfortable about talking about things that I can't take a scientific or legalistic point of view and say, I'm entitled to express an opinion. But my observation is, and I think in Australia, it's supported somewhat, and if I may use Australia as an example, but this will be the same, the Amazon, the wet areas of Africa, and some of the Mediterranean areas, and probably around the Middle East. The Middle East must have a fascinating fire history before it was turned into largely desert. So there will be stuff going on there. Otherwise, where did the oil come from? And in Australia, Australia was part of Antarctica. It was called Gondwana land at that stage. It broke off and started drifting north to where it is now, with the top of it just about touching the equator. During that time, it grew an Antarctic species called Northophagus, or the Antarctic beech. And that, according to Professor Peter Kershaw at Monash University, who I used to drink lots of cups of tea with, and occasionally he would go out and have a very long liquid lunch, and then that was the even more interesting discussions, because he was a non-burner and I was a burner. And he has spent his lifetime in coring lakes. Lake George in Canberra is one of them. You'll probably know that because you've undoubtedly driven past it. To look at the ash and the seedlings and all the other indication of species. And his conclusion was that Australia, the eucalyptus wasn't present initially. It was this Northophagus, which was very fire sensitive. Then something about 70,000 years ago, said Peter, 3 things happened simultaneously, and he does not know. The more he found out about it, the less sure he was of what he had found out. And he said at the end of all this, as this is just as he was retiring, he said these 3 things happened simultaneously, and I don't know which caused which, but the 3 things were the Indigenous people arrived in Australia, or the Indigenous people we know now. There's even some suspicion that there were earlier ones than that. They arrived in Australia. Fire arrived in Australia, and the eucalyptus invaded Australia, and the Northophagus fundamentally disappeared. You'll find a few little bits of it around, especially in Tasmania. And that is that could be a dramatic example or proof that the Indigenous people, as Bill Gammage said, made Australia. Now, I suspect the same sorts of things have happened in North America, Canada, almost certainly, and are going on now in the Amazon.
Well, that's great, David. Thank you for this talk, and I find this fascinating with Indigenous heritage, and I think hopefully our viewers can see that there is much bigger pictures to the fire story than just what we normally hear about. And again, thank you for your time.
Okay, it is a pleasure, Mike, and thank you very much for the terrific stuff that the work that you're doing. Thank you.
We're doing this for all of you. If you like what we're doing, please give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. See you next time.